Hello and welcome. My name is Uwais Khan. I am a senior researcher at Istanbul Sabahattin Zaim University at the Center for Islam and Global Affairs. Today we have a very special lecture, a little different from what we've been doing so far, studying geostrategy and the COVID response globally. This lecture is by a very esteemed colleague at Madaniyat University, Zahid Attil, who graduated from Boğaziçi University in 2005 and later completed his doctorate at the University of Chicago in Ottoman diplomatic history and bureaucratic history, and also intellectual history. His dissertation was on, for those of us who are following Ottoman history, on Rustam Pasha. And ever since then, he has published a number of articles and contributed to the field of Ottoman history. This week's lecture is our 10th lecture, which covers the topic of social mobility and the indigenous ruling class in the Ottoman Empire. I would like to turn the floor over to Dr. Attil so that we can have him speak, and then afterwards we will have questions and answers. Thanks for your participation, Dr. Attil.
Hi, thank you for inviting me here. I would like to thank particularly Professor El Aryan for inviting me here to this Ramadan webinar. And it's a pleasure for me to participate this occasion and this conference series. And also I would like to thank all of you for giving me this chance to share my ideas of my new research on the Ottoman history. As you already stated, this is a little bit different from the previous lectures because I'm going to talk more about the early modern Ottoman phenomena, and I will take you back to the realities of the 15th and 16th centuries. So let me share. Sorry. Okay. Yes. I think that should come.
Yes, we can see your presentation.
Yeah. So I will talk about more. I'm going to introduce you a new conceptual and I developed very recently, that the indigenous ruling class. Particularly, I will talk about the Ottoman Vizierate in general, and also I will point out that I will try to revisit the existing literature in a minute, in some sense, and also I would like to introduce a new understanding of how the Ottomans looked, the government and also the bureaucracy at that time. Let me start with an observation from the 16th century. This was Luigi Bassano de Zara, who was a foreign, a Venetian subject from Zara, and he visited and stayed in Ottoman lands for about 8 or more than 10 years. Originally a merchant. But it is a very short observation that the Great Turk, the Sultan, differs from the other great princes who esteem speaking many different languages. For him, it's enough to know that his own language and the Slavic, which he greatly esteems and he understands some and for his own use, this language that is already in the mouth of many nations. In fact, the language is spoken in Dalmatia, Serbia, Bosnia, and whole Albania, smaller Bulgaria, Thessaly, and Peloponnese, and Wallachia, the German borderlands by the people who go to Kranj or Kranoli, in the whole Poland, Bohemia, and Russia. Most of the Crimean people likewise speak this language. It's highly esteemed in Turkey, specifically in the Ottoman Empire, because the Great Turk has pashas from this nation, as he has always had. Now he has the one who is Rustam Pasha, his son-in-law, as well as many Sanjak governors, provincial governors, janissaries, Allah's messenger, and most of the cavalry soldiers. Writing a generation later, the historian Mustafa Ali described the nature of politics around the middle of the 16th century, that the point of recourse and refuge was only the gate of Grand Vizier, and those who were in need had only to have his dispensation. Considering these two observations, it will be appropriate to ask the several questions that what does it mean that Ottomans appointed viziers from the men of Balkan lands, particularly men coming from the lowly background? And in this case, we are observing that the most of the viziers that are serving the Ottoman Empire were coming from the devshirme, that I will talk more about in my talk. What do I mean by devshirme and how we should understand this? In fact, the consideration and observation of Mustafa Ali, the historian, the viziers attained this position were not from the not only from the devshirme, but also they enjoyed an extensive authority in administration. Why did the Sultan delegate his powers to viziers, particularly coming from lowly background? Or more appropriately speaking, how did he trust them? And ultimately, and we observe in Islamic history in general, we have many powerful viziers coming out, for example, from the Abbasid period and the Seljuk period, like the Barmekids or the Nizamuddin in the Seljuks. And we have also very powerful viziers in early Ottoman history, like the Chandarli family, that I'm going to talk a little bit about in detail. And also, we have, for example, Ibrahim Pasha from early Süleyman's reign. Anyway, but I'm going to conceptualize this kind of viziers that emerged in the reign of Süleyman the Magnificent was quite different than the kinds of viziers that appeared in in other parts of the Ottoman Empire. The historiography usually holds a periodization that the Ottoman viziers were mostly Ulema Viziers before the Mehmed II, who began his reign in the 1451, more appropriately speaking. And these viziers were coming from, and later, and he appointed viziers of Kul, or slave origin viziers, of the Christian lands, and they were collected devshirme. But I argue in a different way that instead of, I identified three periods of viziers in early modern Ottoman history. So I'm going to offer a new revision in the literature because I wanted to pay attention that we should go beyond the limits of nation-state categories and understand the issues of sovereignty on the one hand and issues of the being indigenous and foreign, that I'm going to address these issues throughout my topic as well. Okay, so what I wanted to have in my mind in is an argument that I want to introduce that before the conquest of Constantinople, conquest Istanbul, there were Ulema Viziers that I'm going to talk more about their nature. And after the conquest of Istanbul, the Mehmed II appointed viziers from the Balkan and Byzantine aristocrat children, and some ulema members as well. But what I argue that after 1533, starting with the rise of Ibrahim Pasha as Grand Vizier, we observe that the rise of the indigenous, the true slave viziers, that are distinct from the previous vizirates. Okay, now let me start with introducing these periods in general. Firstly, before the 1453, we have the list, although this list may change a little bit. Anyway, but the viziers coming from early Ottoman state were selected from the learned class, the ulema members. They mostly receive education in madrasa in Anatolia, and they usually followed a career path that included service in judge, and military service as military judge, and then as a vizier. So the Ottoman Sultan mentioned Alaaddin Pasha as the first Ottoman vizier during the reign of Orhan Bey, but after him we also have different viziers. And the most important family, of course, as you can notice, the Chandarlı family, who was originally a madrasa graduate family, and they are Ulema family. And what we know, for example, and especially during the reign of Mehmed II and then Murad II, Chandalı Halil Pasha was a very famous one. He was very important in defending the position of the learned class in administration at a time when the men of military origin began to gain more room in the bureaucracy. And especially he was known for his reluctance to the siege of Istanbul. Anyway, what we observe in the early period that the relationship between the Viziers and Ottoman dynasty in that period to be similar to the Ottoman experience. The Viziers belonged to the Ayan, the notables, who supplied the human resource for the bureaucracies in the middle periods. Just like the early examples, the Viziers of the early Ottoman state received their education in institutions that had pre-existed the Ottoman principality, and they carried the knowledge of registering and administering the finances according to the wisdom of the Near Eastern political experience. The ulema dominated the office of judgeship and the vizierate in early Ottoman principality, where the dynasty identified itself with the Gaza ethos, and the knowledge of power of the early Ottoman sultans were limited to the military ventures. This relation between the Ulema Viziers and the Sultan provided significant autonomy and the sphere of negotiation between two sides. And the Sultan and the members of the Ottoman dynasty were in search of consolidating their power and founding a strong basis for their legitimacy, such as the propaganda of the engagement in Gaza and establishing a respectable genealogy for a legitimate rulership. The Ulema Viziers were later claimed to be real representatives of a long tradition of administration in the Near East. It's also worth noting that the function and the career path of a vizier in early Ottoman period were not differentiated from the judicial career. These paths would become more differentiated by the second half of the 16th century. The backgrounds of the man in a judicial position and the vizier were not only the same, but also the career paths of these two tended to merge and form a single path. All of the viziers in that period who has some kind of a learned class background, and they attained the viziers by following a common pattern of performing judgeship and then military judgeship and then reaching to the vizierate. And the autonomy and the power of the ulema in that period also related to a cosmopolitan outlook, which they did not identify themselves with any of the principality in addition to the Ottoman and the other principalities. This was partly because they represented the continuity of the political and social culture that pre-existed these principalities, and partly because their education career usually transcended the boundaries of a principality. For example, the important educational centers were Konya, Bursa, Cairo, Damascus, Tabriz were beyond the Ottoman territories at that time, and the ulema usually frequented the madrasas in these cities. So they have some kind of a cosmopolitan outlook, and they did not limit themselves with the career position in Ottoman lands. So when we come to the reign of Mehmed II in the mid-15th century, he was determined to undermine the power of the ulema in administration. This brings us to the second period, that he believed that his father, the Murad II, had to acquiesce to the knowledge and interest of the viziers, especially the Chandalı Halil Pasha, in following a passive foreign policy. So, existing of some cool origin in the Viziers in its far court did not reduce the power of Khalil Pasha. Mehmed Singh was aware of the fact that he needed Khalil Pasha in a short period, but later, when he secured the conquest, that he dismissed Khalil Pasha and appointed a different person. In the literature, usually Mehmed II's execution of Khalil Pasha and his policy of selecting viziers among the converts has been interpreted as the beginning of a new era in Vizierate, which is also named the rule of the coups. The third call here refers to the military administrative personnel that were selected as slave or through Devshir Melevi, applied on Christian subjects and trained for the purpose of serving the Sultan. The practice of slave original soldiers had been employed in the armies for a long time, since the time of the Abbasid period. The introduction of Devshir Melevi was a method of recruiting soldiers from the Christian peasant subject, was a particular and Ottoman practice. The Janissary army was an important, coming from the mostly recruited from the Devshir system. If we return to the Mehmed II's viziers after the Khalil Pasha, we observe that most of the grand viziers in this period did not belong to the proper cool origin bureaucrats whose career represented typical rise of a son of a Christian peasant to the grand vizier through the recommendation system. They were rather the children of the Byzantine, Serbian, and Albanian noble backgrounds. Some of whom were brought under the care of the Sultan at early age. Some converted Islam voluntarily and joined to the service of the Sultan. For example, Zanos Pasha, who replaced Khalil Pasha in 1453, probably entered into the administrative system, but we have very little information about him. And most importantly, and the most telling vizier of Mehmed II, Mahmud Pasha of Mikhail Angelos, who was the son of a Balkan Byzantine noble family from Novoburgo. He was the grandson of Caesar Manuel Angelos Philanthropos, the ruler of Thessaly, from his father, and also the grandson of the Byzantine nobleman Margo Yagari from his mother's side. His maternal cousin was George Amirutsets, the Pontigric Renaissance philosopher, and his brother Mikhail Angelovich was also among the important man of the Serbian despot Lazar, and who was influential in the conclusion of peace between Ottoman government and the Serbian ruler. So he was captured and also brought in that. The time of his appointment to Grand was very significant, especially in the 1456, after the failure of the siege of Belgrade. Mehmed II, up to that time, the Mahmud Pasha held the office of Beylerbeyi and Governor General of Romania. He was dismissed. He was appointed in the Grand Vizierate in 1456 at some kind of a consideration that Mehmed II tried to control Serbia by some kind of a cooperation with the nobility in Belgrade. I want to save some time and move on to some other examples. Perhaps the most significant example may be the Mesih Pasha, as you see in the slide, some kind under the Chandalan Ibrahim Pasha. Mesih Pasha was the nephew of the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine IX, Polygos. Considering the fact that the Constantine died without a male heir, Mesih Pasha would have been the next emperor if the Byzantine emperor had survived. And he has taken with his brother into the Ottoman policy education after the conquest of Istanbul, and he converted Islam, rose to the position of Grand Vizier during the reign of Bayezid II. And in 1450 and 1483. And he was influential in the Bayezid foreign policy concerning the question of Jem. Anyway, and another example, Persekzade Ahmet Pasha was the youngest son of Vukcic Kosaka, the Duke of St. Sava in the southern Bosnia, who was called in the Bulgar palace Herzog. Mehmed VI annexed the land in 1463. The Duke of St. Sava accepted Ottoman suzerainty. His youngest son, who would be known as Ahmed, was born around 1450s in Castelnuovo, where he spent his childhood and was educated in Dubrovnik. And one of his older brothers, Patrick Lotko, seized his share in the father's inheritance in 1472. The friend Stepan, who would be known as Ahmed, voluntarily went to Istanbul and converted to Islam, but kept his links to his homelands. And has said that Ahmed Pasha was then raised in the palace and married to the Hünde Hatun, the daughter of the Bayezid II, and he held the position of Grand Vizier 5 times during the reign of Bayezid and Selim. And in that sense, he had again some kind of coming from the noble background in the Balkan lands. And Bukagizad Ahmed Pasha, another example from the Albanian nobility, his ancestor Duke Jean founded the Duchy of Shkodër. After the conquest of Albania, some members of the Duke went into Italy and some then came to Istanbul. Bukagizad Ahmed and his brother Mehmed joined Ottoman service, and ultimately Bukagizad Ahmed Pasha became governor of Anatolia, and he was appointed as the Grand Vizier in 1514. So, except for some kind of small, short reigns of the Ulema Grand Viziers again, most of the Viziers, starting from Mehmed II until the end of the Selim I, the Viziers coming from mostly the Byzantine and the Balkan noble families. What I was to emphasize that their noble background helped and facilitated their appointment to the Grand Vizier, as if it was some kind of a structure that if Ottoman Empire had not extended their territories beyond up to that lands, these children, these noble people, would have continued to rule in their regions. What changed was actually there's some kind of an accommodation in the Ottoman system. But what I argue, in the third period, starting from the 1523, the Ottomans began to appoint from the indigenous, as I call it, the Kul or Indigenous Viziers. The first Indigenous Vizier of Suleiman was Ibrahim Pasha, who was from Parga, a Venetian colony in Adriatic coast. He was captured by a Pasha known as Iskandar Pasha in late 15th century, and he was again present Ibrahim as a gift to Suleiman. When Suleiman ascended the throne in 1529, he was appointed as the chief of the private chamber in the palace, and then he raised him to the Grand Vizierate. After the Ibrahim Pasha's mysterious fall in 1536, Ayas Pasha rose to the Grand Vizier, who was again from Albanian origin, who was born in Albania and taken as a Devshirme boy to the Ottoman palace during the reign of Bayezid II, and he participated in several campaigns, and ultimately he rose to the Grand Vizierate in 1536, and he died because of plague. That was also very meaningful in these days, and because of the contagious disease of plague in 1539. And he was replaced by Lütfü Pasha, who is famous with the general Ottoman history, Tawari Ali Osman, and the vice book to the Vizier Asafname. He was probably born in 1488, and he was taken as a Devshirme boy again from Almonia and brought to Istanbul. And he graduated from the Enderun, and I'm going to talk more about the structure of their education. And ultimately, he was raised to the Grand Vizierate in 1539, and he served for 2 years. And then he was replaced by Hadim Süleyman Pasha, who was very famous with his exploration in the Indian Ocean, and was also the siege of Deir in 1538. And he was welcomed and he rose to the Grand Vizierate in 1541. And Rustem Pasha, who was an important member, again was taken as a Devshirme boy in early age, and he was educated in the Ottoman palace, and he rose to the certain provincial governorates, and ultimately he became Grand Vizier in 1544. And he was dismissed for a short period in 1553, but he was able to restore his position 2 years later. And another famous one, of course, that did an important member, Sokullu Mehmet Pasha, who was again from Serbia, from Bassano, which is near Visegrad, and he went from the end as a chief taster and then served as the chief gatekeeper. And he served as a short period as the Grand Admiral, and then he was able to rise to the Grand Vizier position. What is significant here is that I wanted to emphasize in general that the viziers were all recruited from the Devshirme and with the ignoble origins, and their careers structured through the Ottoman institutions. So I want to talk a little bit about the Ottoman institutions at that time that helped them to form their careers distinctively different from the previous the division of the previous periods. Particularly, the viziers who rose to the power during the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent were systematically drawn from the Devshirme system. Devshirme literally means collection. Unlike the viziers of the previous periods in the Islamic policies, these viziers had no family experience in administration, had no any noble titles. They were collected from Christian peasant families at early age and brought to Ottoman capital and educated in certain arts and assigned in inner service, called as endeavor of the Ottoman palace. When they graduate from inner service, they become eligible for administrative posts in the provinces and at the center. What made them different from the previous generation of viziers was that their career depended solely on their education out of institutions and the favor they received from the Sultan as a reward for their loyal service to him. The careers of viziers from Suleiman's reign were less directly connected to the triumph of the ruling dynasties, as they were from the families that categorically formed a potential group of people who would take the task of administration in any dynastic formation. Even if the rule of a particular dynasty happened to cease to exist, the viziers and other bureaucrats class of scribes and guards offered their service to the new triumphant dynasty, and their cosmopolitan outlook was totally found normal. Though Mehmet II initiated the marginalizing the ulema from the vizierate, he raised another group who had already been ruling in these geographies. In contrast, the indigenous Negro viziers that I'm talking here, starting from the Suleiman's reign, owed their education and career only to the Ottoman educational institutions. If they had not been conscripted as Devshirme and brought to the capital, they would have continued to live as peasants in the Christian villages because of the lack of any noble title or professional art at hand. They had no alternative career path other than being servant to the Sultan. Unlike the previous generations, their knowledge and authority was respected only within the Ottoman political structure. Therefore, they were indigenously grown viziers whose career options were structured within Ottoman bureaucracy. So we can ask how they were conscripted and educated. How did the Devshirme system work? The origin of the system goes back to the 14th century. I don't want to go into detail. Is some kind of a suggestion coming from a person who's known in the Mollahs and coming from the Karaman lands, suggested that it's right to the ruling person, the ruling elite, to receive the 1/5 of the captives, and this was the original of the Janissary army. Anyway, I want to keep it short that in order to increase the number of the Janissary personnel, the Ottomans introduced the devshirme system by collecting Christian young boys from the Balkan lands, and they were trained in the military arts. Firstly, what we want to emphasize that we should look at the origins of the process of the devshirme in some historical way. The devshirme system worked in the 14th and the 15th century mostly for the military services. Whereas, especially after the construction of the Ottoman palace, as we know today, the Topkapı Palace, it was the devshirme began to be used for also some kind of like administrative personnel as well. So it was some kind of a recruitment system it worked as some kind of a recruitment system for the Southern Army administration, but it's some kind of a developed that in the late 15th and perhaps early 16th century. So in that sense, we should be clear in terms of the historical development of the institution. What was changing, especially in the Süleyman's reign, was that he particularly tried to form a new structure which could allow the ignoble background people to rise to the high-level positions. For example, especially the landmark of change was an edict that was issued in 1531, where Süleyman addressed the complaints of the viziers who resented the entrance of some peasants, known as the Ecnebi, or literally speaking, foreigner, into the Ottoman provincial position, and declared that the administrative position were indeed for all subjects. This was very significant because of two reasons. Firstly, the Süleyman ascended throne at a time when the administrative elites had entrenched their oligarchic interests in such a way that they represent a long tradition of political culture of governing in the Near East, and while the Ottoman dynasty had depended on their knowledge and experience in the arts of governing. Excuse me. It was also a time when a highly rigid social structure was envisioned by the elites in order to close the path by the children of the subjects, re'aya, to join the club of the military administrative personnel. The administration should remain, according to the vision of the elite, in the hands of those who belong to the askeri class by birth of year, either belong to the Byzantine or Soviet aristocracy or ulema class, who had pre-exit Ottoman enterprise. It seemed that up to the time of the Süleyman, the Sultan had to enforce the loyalty of the bureaucratic by distributing them a certain allowance called as nekeriye. The fact that the bond between a household and those individuals who joined the service of the Ottoman household voluntarily was achieved through the allowance of some kind of money or some kind of a tribute. At that time, it seemed the relationship between the Sultan and also the governing elite, some kind of a primus inter pares, some kind of a first among equals, they had some kind of cooperation. And after an authoritarian centralizing the reign of the Selim I, the practice of this kind of cooperation began to disappear gradually. Especially when Süleyman ascended the throne, the viziers were inclined to continue their oligarchic nature of administration and prided themselves by surviving the cruelty of the previous Sultan Selim. And they took it for granted and natural that the Sultan had to follow the procedure in administration, and the viziers were supposed to follow the path to the ground by order. Süleyman initially cooperated and acquiesced to the ambition until he consumed his power, and he appointed his favorite Ibrahim Ağa to the Grand Vizier in 1523, while Ibrahim had no previous experience in government. And the rise of Ibrahim Pasha was resented by viziers of the existing period, who still placed their own ambitions and interests before the young sultan's prestige. And in their perspective, the sultan should respect their acquired position and should not have brought an outsider as an ejnebi to the grand vizier. The Edict of 1531 marked, therefore, the break of oligarchic tendency of the elites who had some kind of a noble or the cosmopolitan background, and the Suleiman declared that anyone in the Ottoman realm was his slave or cool, and no one could be called as a foreigner, while everyone had the right to hold and administer position at the center or in provinces. The second aspect of the edict is marked that Ottoman self-confidence and the belief on the efficacy of the Ottoman institutions. It was implied that having an education in Ottoman institutions founded by the dynasty and offering a loyal service to the Sultan was more important than any family background or any kind of a non-Ottoman affiliation. The arts of government now could be learned through the service in Ottoman institutions. It was no longer transferred from outside source like the previous centuries. In order to be eligible for a high position, one should only receive education in Ottoman education institutions, particularly in the Ottoman palace. So the system of Deşirme was suited best for this new system because the collected pages came to the palace as a more permeable and trainable according to the Ottoman ideals of the loyal service and effectiveness. And their conditions were seen as a tabula rasa, and through education they could be equipped with the most sophisticated culture and knowledge concerning the state and government. Therefore, the palace education in a court were crucial for the rise of indigenous bureaucratic class. What I wanted to emphasize is that the graduates of these inner service in the palace, who were originally collected from as a Deşirme boy from Balkan families, as some kind of as villagers, they had chance to now to rise to the higher positions. What is significant here is that their career solely formed by the Ottoman institution, and their career were only meaningful to within the Ottoman system because of the fact that they had no some kind of a noble title and they had no some kind of education that could be okay in other political systems. They had to be loyal as much as possible to the Ottoman Sultan, and in that sense, I wanted to call it as something like indigenous because of their solidity, the career formation, and their prospect of the career for the later. Okay, so I wanted to stop here, and if any question. I would be happy to answer and also detail of my argument. So
thank you very much, Dr. Acil, for that enlightening talk. Something that these are details about our state tradition. When I say our state tradition, I mean a Muslim state tradition, which we don't think about. A lot of times. A lot of us who come to politics from the standpoint of trying to indigenize our politics, which we feel like has been alienated after the colonial experience. We do little, actually, to learn about the actual traditions, especially those that were in effect on the eve of colonialism in the Ottoman Empire or the Mughal Empire or the Safavids. These are long state traditions that we can tap into. So thank you for giving us a more intimate look at the bureaucracy, which, as political scientists, the bureaucracy is a main function, main arm of the government. I have a couple of questions.
Sure.
And maybe we can have a discussion around that. Besides that, I will be monitoring the social media for any kinds of any kinds of comments or questions that are coming from our viewers. So, number one, I wanted to say is that your talk interestingly showed a transition from a class of ulema who were mostly tapping into the Near Eastern state practices. So by that I think you mean places like Persia, Anatolia, maybe even somewhere in Damascus or Egypt. And then there comes a shift where the Ottoman Empire begins to recruit, makes a civil class, a civil bureaucracy, through recruiting from Christian lands, newly conquered Christian or Eastern European lands. And now, there's a little point of clarification. Were those who were recruited part of the nobility of those places, or were they part of the slaves? Because that makes a difference, right, about social mobility.
Yeah. Okay. Let me start with answering the question. Firstly, the institution of vizierate was a Near Eastern phenomenon that we can trace back to the Sasanian period. What we observe in Islamic history, for example, in the Abbasid period, we observe certain Persian origin people who served in the vizierate, like the Bermekids, Khalid bin Mermek, and also we know the Yahya bin Khalid al-Bermeki. And later also we have other Persian origin. They transferred the arts of government from the Sasanian experience to them, the Abbasid enterprise. What we observe, especially again for the Seljuks as well, that some kind of a Near Eastern wisdom of arts of governing was carried out by certain the groups of people who you can identify as Marshall Hudson called them as the Ayan, notables, because they have some kind of a continuity in the administrative positions. And they also are the transmitters of that wisdom. So the ruling elite might be a military background, but they cooperated with this Ayan in order to rule of the conquered territories. So this was some kind of the wisdom that the Ottomans inherited from the long tradition. And in early periods, the ulema also represented the arts of governing as particularly the arts of registering and also arts of composition, especially when writing letters and also the fermas. They should be some kind of the penned by people who know the arts of composition, in the arts of insha in general. When we come to the Mehmed II's shrine, there's some kind of an understanding in the literature that I want to revise, that he immediately began to recruit people from the Kul origin. But I want to emphasize that the viziers from the time of Mehmed II were mostly noble background children. And this continued for about 70 years up in general until the end of the. What we observed during the reign of Süleyman II, he appointed the viziers coming from ignoble Christian villagers. And what is significant here is that unless they were captured or they were recruited as a Devshirme boy, they would remain as a Christian villager. And they had no any other chance to rise to that position. But what we observe, even if the Ottoman, it was the Ottomans that made them Grand Vizier or some kind of elite. But the noble background people or some kind of a cosmopolitan ulema also served as a social group, not only in Ottomans but also in other principalities, and especially in the case of the Balkan nobility. And they had two options. They either go to the European courts because they have noble titles, or they can join the Ottoman system. And we also some examples in that case, like the Hershegzade Ahmet Pasha and the Dukayzade Ahmet Pasha. Is some kind of a career choice for them. And if they had some kind of problem, they can still go to the European courts and they would receive welcome because of their noble background. Whereas in the Suleiman shrine, the viziers were only and exclusively from the Christian villagers, and they had no any kind of a family background that would make their career particularly important. What is important is that their service and their education in other institutions.
Can I ask, okay, because you spoke in the beginning about nationalist historiography and trying to get past nationalist historiography in Ottoman history. But here's some complications that come to my mind when we deal with this question. Number one is why we know the Ottoman family to be a Turkic family of origin. Putting aside Arabs, Kurds, Persians, and others who were part of the empire, why did he even serve the Turkish? I mean, the Turkish ethnic ties of the early tribes. Why did it serve them to move towards a bureaucratic class that was non-Turk? Forget about the other Muslim ethnicities in the empire, but just focusing on the pure interest of the Ottoman family themselves, of their tribe. What were the reasons for that? It seemed very strange.
Yeah. What I want to, and this also, perhaps I need to discuss a little bit about the concept of indigenous that I am introducing, because I am defined in a different way. Because in the anthropological perspective, the term indigenous is used for, especially for the people who are living in a particular region, who were called as the originals of that region. Especially as some kind of post-colonial fact or post-colonial term that was introduced in academic works. But what I call as indigenous in this is a little bit different, because the Ottoman Empire is a multi-ethnic empire, and also as a multinational and a multi-religious empire. Those who are particularly original or some kind of indigenous is not exactly what we observe in the nationalist perspective. Because, and I just want to emphasize, because in the national state perspective, we observe is some kind of a tacit agreement that the sovereignty belongs to the nation, and that whoever is born into that nation and whoever is serving to the nation is called indigenous. But in the early pre-modern period in the Ottoman structure, the sovereignty did not belong to any nation, not even Turks, but it belonged to the Ottoman dynasty. So as some kind of a concept, the education or some recruitment and also service should be due to some kind of particular group, but particular to the Ottoman dynasty. So whoever developed a career solely within the institutions founded by the dynasty, and whoever saw their education as some kind of a loyal to the service to the Sultan, I term them as the indigenous. In that sense, the devshirme of the Christian Balkan villagers seem to be the most indigenous. And this is not my observation. From a 16th century perspective, for example, historian Mustafa Ali called the devshirme boys as the true Ottomans. In that sense, I wanted to pay attention to the indigenous, that sometimes the nation state categories may inhibit our perspective to understand what was happening in the early modern period.
Can I ask you? There's some questions that have also come in on our live Q&A, and I will. One of them is, what was the education system that trained the civil bureaucracy, right? The school viziers, number one. And another thing, before you answer that as well, to me the timing is very interesting, right? So you're by the history that you've laid out, when the Ottomans were expanding towards mainly towards the European side, they were relying on a cosmopolitan ulema class that was coming mostly from Near Eastern backgrounds. But then, during Sultan Selim's time, where you say that, where we get a definite break from that past tradition to indigenous, what you call indigenous viziers, the Ottomans have now turned their attention towards Muslim lands. They have, the Egypt, large parts of the Maghreb, the Hijaz, Iraq are now under Ottoman control, and now the bureaucracy seems to be not from those lands. They seem to be coming from lands in Eastern Europe. So it almost seems like, when the Ottomans were expanding into Europe, they were using a bureaucratic class that was not from there. And then, as they turned their attention towards the Muslim world, as they grew in power, that the ruling class came from Europe. Is that something that makes any sense, or am I just making some grand speculations without nuance?
It's some kind of a matter of timing, because especially concerning the reign of Selim, the first is a very short reign, only 8 years, and we also know that he had plans to make an expedition towards Europe, but he died before carrying out his plans. So if he had lived longer, he would have been in the other campaigns to Europe. Because of the Safavid question that the 8 years were filled mostly with the Eastern question. It's some kind of because of the short reign of the Selim. But anyway, what is significant is that in both of the terms, the ruling elite coming from some kind of a noble background, either as a ulama is also a noble background, and the Christian Balkan families also coming, the viziers are coming with a noble background. The next stage, the viziers who ruled were mostly the ignoble background, and they were educated within the Ottoman system that was come to a little later. Sometimes that and I treat both the ulama and also the I don't treat both ulama and the Christian Balkan noble viziers not as Ottoman, because they don't have anything particular to the Ottoman institutions, because they were not trained, their career was not dependent on their service to the Ottoman Sultan, because they were...
Can you expand on their training, their education, that was so special, that was so different?
And also they have always career options. If they have some kind of resentment to the policies of the Sultan, they still have option to go beyond the other lands. They will be welcomed by. And we have some examples, for example, the ulama traveling from Ottomans to the other lands, the Mamluks, and also we have examples from the noble people who were traveling from the Ottomans to the European courts. There's some kind of a continuity of the exchange, but that stopped during with the rise of the Suleiman's reign, because he recruited from the Christian origin and who converted to Islam, of course, the villagers, and they could not go beyond Ottoman lands because they were not noble and they were not have some kind of a madrasa education that could be applicable in other lands. What I wanted to emphasize here is that in the modern sense that we are living in the nation-state phenomena, we observe indigenous and foreigner in some kind of, for example, usually it's called Devshirme is called a foreigner. If one of my friends asked me several months ago, what was the relationship? The question was that what was the relation between the foreigners and the ulama? Or more appropriately, he said that what was the relation between the Devshirme and the indigenous people? But what I could, no, I call the Devshirme as the indigenous and the ulama as foreigner. Do you understand what I'm, because the career formation and also the service and the loyalty is a very much structurally important in the conceptualization of the indigenous. And I'm trying to associate all of these to the phenomena that the sovereignty was significantly critical because, as a legal speaking, the sovereignty belonged to the Ottoman dynasty, and the service and education also was a very important factor for identifying these individuals.
Thank you so much. Another question that came as a kind of epilogue to your talk. I mean, your period covered from the beginning to Sultan Suleiman's reign, but some of our participants wants to know what happens afterwards. I mean, does this trend continue? I mean, especially talking about Sultan Abdul Hamid's policies, Abdul Hamid II in the civil bureaucracy. I know it's out of the scope of your talk, but if you could comment on whether or not this practice of recruiting from Christian backgrounds continues well into modernity, and then we know that in certain cases of Ottoman history, the bureaucratic class played a very important role in dethroning certain sultans. For instance, especially Abdul Hamid comes to mind here, where the bureaucratic class stepped in and deposed the sultan, right? Why wasn't there any threat of this internal, tensions by these people that were recruited from outside?
Okay. Firstly, we need to treat the 19th century in a different way, because especially the modernity and especially the Tanzimat reforms and some kind of the formation of a new understanding in the bureaucracy was quite different the period that I'm talking. If I want to emphasize a little bit significant to the 19th century, especially with the promulgation of the Edict of Gülhane, the Tanzimat Edict in 1839, it redefined the relationship between the bureaucracy and the Sultan, and also it officially accorded that the nation, or some as an Ottoman nation, now had the sovereignty. In that sense, as some kind the understanding of the constitutional regime was originated in the Tanzimat Edict. It's some kind of the Abdul Hamid's deposition, or deposing Abdul Hamid, was an outcome of the development in the 19th century, which was quite different from the period. In other words, in the 19th century, sovereignty was defined to belong to the nation. But the term nation is ambiguous in that sense, because it was originally as an Ottoman nation that would encompass all the nations and the religious people and also all kinds of ethnicities. Later it was revised, included perhaps only the Muslims and perhaps only the Turks. It was somewhat ambiguous in any way, but somehow those who were living in Ottoman lands were considered to be holding the sovereignty at that time. It's quite different than what we have observed in the pre-Ottoman period, pre-modern Ottoman experience. Of course, what we observe at the rise of the indigenous bureaucratic group, viziers in the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, it continued for a while, at least until the end of the 16th century, and it continued in the 17th century. At least we can identify by the middle of the 17th century, we saw the rise of some civil bureaucratic viziers, or the viziers who are coming from either ulema or coming from some kind of civil service. What is significant is that once the bureaucracy become indigenized by the Suleiman's time, and the bureaucrats or some kind of ulema who served as the vizier in the late 17th and early the 18th century, were not very much differentiated from the structure that was introduced by Suleiman the Magnificent. In other words, they are still felt themselves loyal to the Ottoman, and they had no any kind of an option to go beyond Ottoman lands. Especially, it was some kind of a fragmentalized between the Sunni and the Shiite empires that between Ottomans and Safavids was some kind of a sharp distinction. They had legal options from to going beyond Ottoman lands. In other words, the system continued in the later era. The people who served as the vizier were not the Ulema Vizier.
Thank you very much. I want to return back to the first question about changing from the ulema class. On your reading, there's not a sharp shift. I mean, the literature says that there's a sharp shift, but you're saying that it was a kind of a soft shift because after 1453, he was still recruiting from the nobles, from the Christian lands, and then it was basically after Selim II, right, that we get the full ignoble Christian peasants who are now being part of the Ottoman bureaucratic class. Is that correct?
Yeah.
That's the way. Okay, so my question is, the question that some of the viewers have asked is, what is the specific political and advantages or reasons for why this happened? Why did this happen? I mean, specifically, what was the advantages, strategic reasons for why this was something that the Ottomans wanted to do?
Okay, I understand the question why it was some kind of soft shift, not a sharp shift, and I'm explaining why ultimately it shifted as well.
Yeah. Yes.
Firstly, let me explain why it's a soft shift, because because of the absence of the available educated people, or some insufficient number of the educated people that would be
the human resource problem.
Human resource problem. So if you are angry with one group, then you can cooperate with another group. But whatever you want to recruit people who are absolutely loyal to the Ottoman Sultan, that should appear sometime later. It took time, and especially the timing is significant because the construction of the Topkapı Palace completed towards the last 10 years of Mehmed II's reign. So the indigenous viziers who were educated in the palace education began towards the end of the Mehmed II's reign, and they could attain higher positions in the Bayezid and perhaps in the Selim's reign, and they could attain the position of the Grand Vizier only in the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent. It's some kind of a matter of timing. Why the sultans tried to shift from the ulema or the noble background Christians to the ignoble Orientals, because they want people to be loyal to them. So absolutely. And
that raises the question of the loyalty question, raises the issue of households. So by the 17th and 18th century, we start seeing very powerful households. I mean, that are trained in the bureaucracy, both in the ilmiya and in the what do you call the kitabiya. Both of them, they begin to have these very huge households. So, I mean, you can begin to have loyalty once you have established, once you've entered, and one of your people have become Grand Vizier. Then you can start creating a new patron-client networks that go all the way down, and it's almost as though you are, to some degree, an independent actor at that point. I mean,
of course, but the households existed always. It existed pre-Ottoman period, and it existed in the Ottoman period. The nature of the households changed a little bit by the Suleiman's reign in that sense, because now the leaders of the households, that the Devshirme Viziers, for example, they have no any other career plans beyond. For example, we observe from the early period a case of the Sheikh Bedid was a clear example in that sense, because he received education. He was born in Romania, and he received education in Edirne. Then he went to Konya, and then he went to Cairo. He received an education, and he went to Tabriz, for learning the secret science. Anyway, ultimately, he returned the Ottoman lands as if that his career and his education were complete and were formed beyond the Ottoman lands. So he by education he was a foreigner. Anyway, but he served in Ottomans. It was at the time of the interregnum period. He served in Musa Çelebi as a short period as Kazasker, the military judge. And then Musa Çelebi was defeated by his brother Mehmet Çelebi in 1413, and he became jobless. And he was sent to exile in Iznik, but he considered him as he doesn't deserve that low position, that jobless position anyway. So he initiated a claim by traveling to the Rumelia and collected people from the Timar holders in the Rumelia and raised a rebellion in order to create a new dynasty. And by he claimed that I am more superior than the Ottomans. In that sense, there's some kind of the Ulema family and the noble backgrounds of the Byzantines did not consider them as inferior to the Ottoman Empire. Somehow they become successful. We are cooperating them. If we have a chance that we can create our own dynasty, and we have small examples in other dynasties in other parts of Anatolia, like the Safavids was a good example in that sense. They could serve and create a new dynasty. And Kandıburhanettin was another example. What is significant here is that by the middle of the 16th century, the people who rose to the power did feel something absolutely clear that they are inferior to the Ottoman dynasty. They can enlarge their wealth, they can have some kind of large extended household, but they could not claim beyond to create beyond creating some kind of an independent enterprise, because they knew that their noble background is the noble background would inhibit to carry out these plans. That's
actually, I mean, what you've described so far, there's a certain ways that it's from when we look at, like, for instance, a Sunni relationship with political power, in which the Sultan and his the bureaucracy should, from certain interpretations, be seen not as above the people, but actually as employed by the people. It almost shows that, the ruling class of the Ottomans had kind of made that an institutional priority, where people of noble descent were not involved in politics, yet they could be involved in, say, the Ilmiya, or I don't know how, and also the Askariya, right? I mean, they could also be recruited into the army. So the idea that the Sultan was a sovereign functionary of the Ummah, or of the people, the Muslim people, maybe this was institutionalized by this practice that you're saying here. Maybe.
Okay, especially that, for example, when we look at the early Islamic history, especially the times of Umayyads and the Abbasids in general, as you correctly pointed out, the caliph is actually the person who was elected by the people. And the contract between the people and also the Ummah and also the caliph legitimized his rule. It was only a political ruler. This also was a fact, as a juristic perspective of the caliphate, was the phenomenon in the Abbasid period, and Al-Mawardi, Al-Ahkam Sultana clearly identified the details of this relationship. What we observe, as the recent literature tried to underline, is that with the 16th century, especially in the Suleiman's reign, we observe a different kind of understanding in caliphate, which is not only a juristic understanding, but the contractual relation between the caliph or the sultan and the people, but now there's some kind of understanding, a Sufi perspective, that the caliphate is something bestowed by God directly to the Ottoman dynasty, And the dynasty was chosen by God to rule the world, and the person who is ruling, is not in the same level of the original people. It's sometimes the relationship between the people and the Sultan shifted significantly in the 16th century. Now we are some kind of a guiding people, a guiding person who received guidance directly from God, as was conceived by the 16th century political writers. And a recent book, Hussein Caliphate Redefined, formulated this and also described how this reformulation of the caliphate was introduced in the modern political literature. And what I emphasize that the structure that emerged in the 16th century, the sovereignty now belonged to the person who was considered above and absolutely in control of the whole Ottoman enterprise. Whoever is going to rise to that position has to receive the favor and also the support of the Sultan, because he is superior than others. In that sense, the other legitimacy were freed from all kinds of questions that was probably in the 14th and 15th centuries.
Yes, I'm aware of the growth of the idea of sacred kingship and its literature in Ottoman political history, and the shift that takes place as you've described. That while that might be true of the Sultan himself, I mean, I have my own skepticisms about what Yilmaz describes in his book, because most of his book depends on Idris al-Bitlisi's work, and he was an Akbarian, and there was a lot of other ulema, and his book, and he obviously this was a discussion, this was a new way of talking, but to the degree that Idris al-Bitlisi was the paradigmatic case is something that I would like to push back on. But I mean, he knows better. He's studied this topic for a very long time. In any case, there could be still a distinction between the Sultan himself and the bureaucratic class. I mean, the Sultan could be seen in this kind of, Zillallahi fil ard and all this, very laudatory language. But the bureaucratic class, that means those who are serving him in an administrative vizier position, would they also be seen in this kind of mystical fashion as the Sultan himself, as the office of the personality of the Sultan himself?
Yeah, if they belong to some kind of a long tradition of the noble background or some kind of a ulema family, they would claim themselves a similar argument. Okay, they also receive some kind of a divine light, and they are distributing. But now they were not in a position to claim that would rival to the claim of the Sultan. In that sense, only what we observe usually, the Sufi sheikhs usually, or the writers who are writing the biographies or the manaqib of the Sufi sheikhs usually portray some kind of a rival alternative narratives that would the Sultan. In general, the rise of the bureaucrats in general, the bureaucrats that were ruling in the 16th century did not have any position to claim a similar argument for themselves, because their background limited their plans for such kind of appraisals.
Putting this next to, for instance, this argument that was put forward in the Second Ottoman Empire, where he argued that there was a more impersonal relationship with the Sultan. So here we've got two contradictory relationships, right? We've got a stronger and stronger vizierate, a growing vizierate and civil class, and at the same time, so you have on the one hand the argument that as we move towards modernity, the Sultan becomes more impersonal, And then you have Yilmaz saying that as you move towards modernity, the Sultan becomes more metaphysical or mystical. So he's at the same time becoming impersonal. That means effectively his rule. That means effectively the Sultan's control over the daily affairs of the empire is becoming mediated through now a very robust civil class. So they're doing the real work. I mean, that's what we can understand. And yet his position is becoming more and more mystified. You see. So my question is, does the actual practice of governance change?
Yes, exactly. And if you return to the Second Ottoman Empire argument, for example, the Bakitejan argued that it's only 10 years ago that by the early 17th century, there was some new discussion between the constitutionalists and also the absolutists, ultimately reach a position that the constitutionalists become triumphant. What I argue that he actually, although I disagree in several points by pointing on the beginning of the structure, I think that there is the empire that he imagined in the early 17th century that was formed to be a second empire, I think is misrepresented. What I observed that the empire was established, if you want to say something, as a bureaucratic empire by the Süleyman's reign, but the character of the empire was still in debate. And ultimately, there's some kind of absolutist tendencies of the Ottoman Sultan. In other words, the governance shifted by the establishment of the new empire in the middle 16th century in such a way that now that the center of power, not only the Sultan, something is beyond to the daily politics. Now the daily politics is engaged and particularly controlled by the vizier, and this time the Sultan securely and confidently bestowed and relegated all his rights and all his capacities to the vizier, because he did not see that vizier as a rival to his sovereignty, because he has no ignoble background. Now, is that the shift that corresponded at the same period that is that we saw after the middle of the 16th that the rise of the bureaucratic offices, not only because the empire expanded, but also because the Sultan now feel confident and he was elevated beyond the question of an ordinary person. So what was significant in the 17th century, the Sultan wanted to again land on the daily politics, but this time the viziers and all the other elites said, no, you should be above everything. That's why the constitutionalists become. Well, the constitutionalist term should be some kind of looked at it cautiously, because it's some kind of European. It represents some kind of European perspective that should be used cautiously anyway. But I'm repeating because the Bakitejan called them the constitutionalists.
That's very interesting. I also, these two theses that have come out recently in early modern political history, one of Yilmaz's push, which was actually, Afzal Moyin's work was in the background of this kind of push towards looking at the Ottomans as a more mystical political tradition, and then Bakitejan's work. Both of these kind of has shifted our lens towards how to look at the early modern tradition. But I see what you're saying about continuity. There was a kind of continuity between the early period and the later period. It wasn't such a radical shift as Bakitejan describes in his book.
Yeah.
I have two other questions, and these we might have to close with these because we're coming towards our end. First is what were the limits of power from a constitutionalist perspective? If we look from a modernist, I know it's kind of anachronistic to think this way, but if we look from a modernist perspective, and we're doing what they called in the 19th century fiqh al-dasturi, like if we're trying to figure out what are the limits of power, what would be the balance of power between viziers and the sultan in this classical period? And were viziers, as you rightly pointed out just now, that the sultan and the viziers were given so much power because they had actually no real independent voice. So for instance, when we say that there was social mobility in the Ottoman Empire, does that put tension in that claim that they had a kind of ascendancy? Because their ascendancy was basically being a puppet to the Sultan as a puppet master.
Okay. Firstly, the relationship between the vizier and the sultan, of course, changed over time, and especially in early period when the sultan's legitimacy was still in question. And he cooperated with the ulema and also later with the Balkan Byzantine aristocratic families in order to elevate his position. We should be aware that the Ottomans were not very noble, were not coming from very aristocratic families. In other words, their lineage was not considered very noble to deserve the rule. When their inception, the guiding legitimacy was that either you should be coming from the Gengizid lineage, or you should have some access to the Muslim Caliphate, and Ottomans lacked both of them. In that sense, their engagement with Gaza was a significant tool for boosting their legitimacy on the one hand, and also they cooperated with the ulama because they needed them to administer the country. And at the same time, when they understood that the ulama has some kind of a rival thoughts, some kind of plans that are not absolutely in line with the Ottoman dynastic procedure, or some kind of dynastic plans, the Mehmed II tried to shift the alliance for another group. And the relationship between still continued in a similar way, especially when we observed it during the reign of Bayezid II, the relation between Sultan and the Viziers were so much close and also so much rivalrous as well, because the oligarchic tendency of the noble background Viziers, with noble background, imposed their own position, their own wishes to the Sultan, and the Sultan had to acquiesce their desires because they are broken-hearted because of the issue of the Gem Sultan. And similarly, Selim tried to break this power of the Vizier, but ultimately it became effective. In other words, the authority of the Sultan became a little bit superior than the ruling elite only in the time of Suleiman the Magnificent. In other words, the reign of Suleiman marked a period in which the Sultan was able to elevate himself beyond any existing ruling, any existing dynasty. This could be a Vizier dynasty, this could be an Ulema dynasty. Up to that time, they were always in some kind of a on the same level. Beyond that, he delegated his power to the ignoble indigenous viziers, and everybody understood, and it's something that he elevated his position on the one hand, and the political literature reflected in that sense, in a way that they, for example, writing in the middle of the 16th century, Lütfi Pasha addressed directly to the vizier because he saw that now it was the vizier who was doing the actual daily politics, and he wrote his book as a guide to the vizier, and that he called his book as the Asafnama, the Book of Viziers. Also referring to the Prophet Solomon's famous vizier as something eponym of the paragon of the absolutely powerful vizier.
Can I, because we're running out of time, I just want to let you know that we have about 5 more minutes left. So I have one more question, and then we'll close.
Okay.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Let me stop with this. So in that sense, the relationship between the vizier and the sultan changed significantly during the Suleiman's reign, and this was something that happened for the first time, as I argue, in Ottoman history, but also in previous Ottoman the pre-Ottoman dynasties as well.
I wanted to close our session on the last point that you had began with about anti-national, like getting over nationalism in Ottoman historiography, because nowadays the memory of the Ottomans and especially the ruling elite of the Ottomans is seen in a very, there's a lot of layers and layers of what can I say, like racism, bias, ethno-nationalism. I mean, there's so much that is caught up in our memory of the Ottomans, both emotionally and politically. So could you say a few words on this very strange state of affairs that we have? We have a large Middle Eastern empire, the Ottoman Empire, Devlet-i Ali Osmaniye, Muhammadiyya, some people say, in which the ruling elite are not even from these lands. So they're not of Eastern Oriental background. They seem to be, on your account, mostly these people who are coming from like newly conquered Christian backgrounds. How was it that this was digestible to these long-standing, very noble Muslim families? Some of them tracing their lineages back to the Sahaba, Akram, to very great ruling families of the Middle East. How are these people just fine with this state of affairs? And how does that cloud, for instance, nowadays, this rivalry between Arabs and Turks over the memory of the Ottomans, when even the people of Anatolia seem to be left out of this bureaucratic class? So, I mean, what are the stakes here? I mean, what's going on here? I mean, can you please give some general comments about nationalism in Ottoman historiography?
Thank you for asking me. I think that one of the basic phenomena that we should understand is that the relationship between the sovereign and the people are not, is not the way that we understand, we observe in the nation state or nationalist perspective. Because we are tacitly a pro or some kind of the sovereignty belong to the nation, but at that time we should accept some kind of go beyond the this categorization that sovereignty did not belong to any particular nation or did not particular to a religious group, but it belonged to a dynasty. Of course, it's not easy to accept, and what is significant is that only if that dynasty is so much superior, so much noble, that would be easier to understand, easier to accept the legitimacy of the ruling dynasty. And what I argue that that became full in the 16th century on the one hand, that the Ottomans will achieve their superior position by the 16th. That's why they could impose these ignoble individuals as a ruling elite. In that sense, this is one thing that we should have said. The other thing is that the sovereignty belonged to the legal speaking at one person or one dynasty, and all remaining parts legally we should accept as equal, or we should be considered not as the people who are in Anatolia as proper Ottoman, because they can travel and they can be any part of on a principality. Especially Anatolia is very significant because we have in Anatolia a significant number of the Kızılbaş families who consider themselves as the true leader in the Safavids. So, should we consider the Kızılbaş people living in Anatolia as indigenous? I think that the key term is how you define your relation with the sovereign and how you define your position to the existing ruler who hold the sovereignty of the whole country. I think that we should go beyond the nationalist and the nation-state categories.
We have that same issue in, like, for instance, the Mughal history. I mean, for instance, we have a lot of Hindu people who come in and become Persianized, for instance.
Exactly.
So like these, I mean, when we talk about political subjectivity, even these people that are coming from these Balkan areas, right? From a young age they have been schooled in
Exactly.
they're pretty much very Persianate. I mean, in a certain sense, right?
That's very true. And at the same time, what is significant is that the Mughal history is very good example, as you highlighted. For example, during the time of Babur, and we read from the Babur Nama, for example, he was very much, he copied very much the people from the Turkic origin, because they left continuously his cause, and they usually contradicted the leaders' arguments. And in that sense, Akbar tried to find a new group of people to cooperate instead of the Muslims. Is there some kind of the relation between the subjects, and also is there some kind that in that way Akbar was able to impose his position as a somewhat superior than any other rival background?
So there's almost like an internal mechanism where you need people who are working underneath you to feel subordinate and loyal, and Muslims actually create problems in that sense. I mean, because they feel like they have the ability to, speak up, talk, to reject your opinions, to intervene. But if there's someone who's wholly dependent on you, then from a bureaucratic perspective, it makes it easier to govern. Is that what I hear you saying?
Yeah.
Okay, Zahid Hoja, it was wonderful. I'm so glad that you were able to join us and share your work with us. I look forward to your book that's going to come out soon. Hopefully we'll see all of this published, and we'd like to see you back at CIGA. Recently we've been talking about trying to do some kind of comparative political theory with modern political theory and Ottoman political theory. It would be great to have your comments and your insight on that issue. Next tomorrow we will have lecture number 11 by Dr. Abdullah Aralian from Georgetown University. He will be talking about beyond soft power, speaking about football as a form of regime legitimization. So we're going from classical Ottoman politics to hyper-modern ways of legitimization through football. This is the world we live in, so we're trying to keep a pace. One last thank you, Dr. Zahid Achil, for your participation, and for all of our viewers, we hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you very much.